Welcome back, everyone. Your host, Michael. On a Thursday, we are continuing our Basics of Biblical Hebrew series here, joined by Louis Dizon, who is our instructor for this. How you doing, Louis? Good to have you back on.
Oh, oh, it's great to be back on. And I believe that we are now 10th session
The 10th.
of Hebrew. Can't believe that also can't believe that
Yeah,
time flies.
it really has. And
Yeah.
I'm trying to think when was the first time we did the first lecture. I know it was over a year ago.
Yeah. I think it was about 9 months at this
9 months,
point.
okay, all right. Well, hey,
Yeah,
look, my perception of time is not the best, as I've
yeah.
said before. All of my days run
Yeah,
together, so
I know. Yeah, so if anyone here has managed to stick around up to session 10, that means that they've already learned enough Hebrew to do some basic reading of the Old Testament in the original language. Like, you're not going to get very far with the amount of knowledge you've arrived at, but you'll able to make stuff, pick out stuff here and there. Um, and we're currently on the verbal system. I believe last session we did the Qal Perfect. So this session will be the imperfect verb. So I'm just booting up the share screen now.
there it is.
Uh, Awesome. So I'm gonna do things a little bit differently from previous sessions. Before, I would start with the translation from the workbook, and then I would go to the grammar lesson. But I think that it might actually be better going forward if we did the grammar lesson first and then the translations afterwards. I will say this though, in the workbook, assuming some of you I realize that not everybody who watches these videos actually has the workbook. If you do, if you're actually serious about learning the language, I highly recommend it because the workbook in particular, I mean, the grammar and the workbook are both important, but the workbook gives you opportunities to actually practice the language. So, as you can see here, there are verb practice sheets. So, exercise 13 is for the Qal verb. So, this is the perfect verb, and then actually, they're all Qal verbs. Um, because we're in the verbal system, one of the things about verbs in general is there's a lot of memorization involved. You have to remember each specific form of the verb. And if you recall last week, when we were talking about the Qal Perfect, we saw that, if we're using shamar as the example, you have shamar, shamra, shamru, and then, shamarti, shamarnu, etc. And if you were paying attention, you will have learned about 8 different forms of the perfect verb. And now that we're in the imperfect, you're going to learn even more forms of the verb. So better get used to memorizing stuff. That being said, let's get to the Qal Imperfect. So we learned what the Qal Perfect was. It represents completed action. So the imperfect, by contrast, denotes incomplete action. So, it's like uh, an action that has not occurred yet, or an action that is in the process of occurring. That's the general gist of what the incomplete verb aspect is. So you may have noticed that that Hebrew verbs don't really operate on tenses the same way English does. And this is a little bit of a linguistics thing that not many people are aware of. That some languages, their verbs are tense based. In other languages, their verbs are aspect based. Hebrew is one of the aspect based languages. There are a few others that operate similarly. The other Semitic languages, like Arabic, are also aspect based. Biblical Greek is aspect based, although modern Greek is tense based. And um, for anybody who happens to be Filipino, apparently Tagalog is also aspect based. Fun fact. Uh, And what that means for the verb is that they don't so I mean you can think of them as tenses, but they don't operate the same way we would use tenses. So the incomplete aspect verb generally maps onto what we would consider the present or the future tense in English. If you see an imperfect verb in Hebrew, a lot of the times it will be translated that way. Now, you may be wondering, well, if it can be both present or future, how do we know which one to use? The answer, of course, would be context. So usually, just from reading through a text, and when you encounter the Qal Imperfect, you usually would know from context whether you should render that as a present tense verb or a future tense verb when you're translating it into English. There's only really a few places where it's genuinely ambiguous, where it could go either way. And I can't think of any off the top of my head, and you don't have to worry too much about them. Um, and even where there is ambiguity, it almost never has any serious like interpretive impact on the text. A lot of times, it is fairly straightforward. Now, this is why verbal aspect can be confusing because the incomplete action can also be used to denote a past event, you know, which can be odd because you might have it in your head that the perfect verb denotes past action. But as we learned, that's not always the case. In fact, the perfect verb can denote present or future action, especially in prophetic passages of the Hebrew Bible. So the way to think of it is usually the perfect tense denotes past. Usually the imperfect denotes present or future, but those are not hard and fast rules. And when exactly does the imperfect denote a past action? Usually it's a habitual or a continuous action in the past. So we have here a couple of examples in the textbook if you're looking at it. In Job chapter 1, verse 5, you had Kacha yaase Iyov kol hayamim. So, in translation, thus Job used to do all the time. So, used to do in the Hebrew is yaaseh. So, you may recognize this as the imperfect form of the verb asa or to do. Um, and if you didn't know the context, you might be tempted to translate this as Job is doing every day, or Job will be doing every day. But you know from the context, because this is talking about a narrative of something in the past, that it is past action. In this case, it's a past continuous action. And then another one, Exodus 15:1, as Yashir Moshe uvnei Yisrael et hashira hazot laAdonai. Then Moses and the sons of Israel were singing this song to the Lord. So Yashir, which is the imperfect form of shir, to sing. And once again, even though it is imperfect, we translate it as a past action here because the context demands that we do so. Um, we will be, yeah. So usually context will let you know how to translate any given verb. So don't rely exclusively on the actual form of the verb when translating something. Also make note of what text you're working with, whether it's a narrative of a historical event or something else that happened in the past. So here is a little box which is a helpful reminder or a helpful like hint of how to think of the imperfect. So the imperfect is incomplete action in the mind of the speaker. Imperfect is generally present or future, but can be continuous past. Now that we know what the Qal Imperfect does, the next question is, how do we identify a Qal Imperfect? So one of the main contrasts between the Qal Perfect and the Qal Imperfect is the Qal Perfect never has any preformatives. For those who don't remember, a preformative is that extra letter that occurs right before the root, the three-letter root of the verb. So let me go back to the previous chapter that we covered last time. So notice in the perfect tense, shamar, shamra, shamru, there's never an extra letter added before it. There's usually one added after it. There always is one added after it, except for the third person singular masculine, because that's the most basic form of the verb. Um, by contrast, when we get to the imperfect form of a verb, here's the conjugation table for it. So notice that there's always a preformative. So it can be a yod, it can be a tav, it can be an aleph, or it could be a nun. And sometimes there will also be a sufformative, or something that is added after the three-letter root. So the way to remember it is the perfect verb never has a preformative, always has a sufformative, except if it's the third person masculine singular. The imperfect verb always has a preformative and sometimes has a sufformative. Um, so if we take, for example, shamar, to keep or to guard, which is one of the most common verbs in Hebrew. If we were to plug it into this table, the forms would be yishmor, tishmor, tishmor, tishmori, eshmor, yishmoru, tishmorna, tishmoru, tishmorna, nishmor. You'll notice that some of them are repeated. For example, third person feminine singular and third person feminine singular and second person masculine singular have the exact same form. The third person feminine plural and the second person feminine plural also the same form. Well, how can we tell them apart? Once again, context. If you run into for example, the word tishmor or any other verb that has this form, you should be able to tell from the surrounding context whether it is she is guarding something or you are guarding something. So let's talk a little bit more about this paradigm. So we'll begin with the third person forms. So there are four of them. Third person masculine singular, third person feminine singular, third person masculine plural, third person feminine plural. By the way, so one of the things you may have noticed, if you, I realize there are a few people who may have already learned how to memorize verbal paradigms in other languages. For example, let's say some of you may have learned it for Spanish or for Greek or Latin. You'll notice that in a Semitic language such as Hebrew, you learn way more forms of the verb than in Greek or Latin, because Greek, Indo-European verbs generally are not gendered, whereas Semitic language verbs are. If you were to use, if you were to say a verb in Greek or Latin, for example, or French or Spanish, the verb by itself will not tell you if the gender of the person doing it, whereas in Hebrew, most of the time it does, which eliminates some of the potential ambiguities that could arise in a Hebrew text, but does raise others, such as when there are similar forms. Anyway, uh, you will see here that what the masculine forms have in common is they all begin with a yod here. So again, let's say we're using shamar as our base verb. We have yishmor and yishmaru. And by contrast, the feminine form is always a tav with a dagesh, as you can see here. And you'll notice that there's no suffirmatives for the singular form, whereas there are for the plural forms. So that's how you will remember it. Yod means it is male, and whereas a tav it's female. Of course, that's not always the case. Once we get into second person, it gets complicated. Um, Notice that there's a third person feminine plural form. So this very rarely comes up. The only time you ever use third person feminine plural is if you're dealing with an all female group of actors doing an action. If it's a mixed group, they will usually use the third person masculine plural. That's, as far as I know, every language that makes this distinction does the same thing. It's only feminine if it's all female, whereas if it's a mixed group or if it's all male, it's masculine. Now, after that, we get to the second person forms. Once again, there are four to consider. There is second person masculine singular, second person feminine singular, second person masculine plural, and second person feminine plural. So remember that if you run into tishmor, it can be either he guarded or you guarded. And you'll have to look at the context to tell which one it is. Fortunately, the feminine singular form is unique, tishmori. So if you find that it has that suffirmative and then it has the yod, the hirek yod at the end, you know it's the u there is a feminine u. And then the same thing we discussed regarding third person plurals applies with second person plurals. We use tishmaru if it's either all men or a group of men and women. We only use tishmorna if it's a group, if it's all women in the group. And once again, note the third person and second person feminine plurals are the same, and there's not a lot of them to begin with, so you will rarely have to worry about this form. You should know that this form exists, but there will be very few times when you will actually bump into it, in which case you will have to determine, is it they are doing it or you are doing it? Usually context will tell you which is which. One note that should be that I should mention, because the textbook does, is the hirek yod for this is similar to the hirek yod that occurs in first person singular pronoun suffixes. So you have the example Susi, my horse. Sus, of course, means horse. The hirek yod here indicates that it is mine. If I say beiti, beit, of course, being house, beiti is my house. But you should not confuse these two with each other, because pronoun suffixes are placed after nouns, whereas these are verbs. So before you get confused by these two forms, first ask yourself, am I dealing with a verb or with a noun? Once you determine which one you're dealing with, you know which paradigm or set of endings to take into account. Now we get to the, okay, that's more of the second person. First person. So let's go up here. Ishmor, Nishmor. So this is easy because only first person imperfects will have these beginnings. So if it begins with an aleph, you know it's singular. If it begins with a nun, you know it's plural. Where you might potentially run into some confusion is when we start introducing nifal stems later on. That will be way down the road. On the textbook, that's chapter 18. We're only in chapter 14 right now, so we won't have to worry about that for a while. Because it is possible to mistake a nifal for a first person plural imperfect qal verb, or vice versa. So you have to be careful. But again, it's one of those times when it helps to memorize your verb charts, because once you take into account the other things, such as the vowels, then it's much less likely for you to make that mistake. So one of the helpful things that the textbook keeps on hammering is the importance of context. When you have an apparently ambiguous form of a verb, context will almost always tell you which form it is. So always take into account what the surrounding words are. Who are the other characters in the story? Is it a direct address? Is it a description? These things will tell you what the correct translation of any given verb are. So that being said, we briefly touched on active and statives when we were talking about the Qal Perfect. So just like with the perfect, the imperfect also has active and stative forms. So historically, the difference between them is that the active verbs had class A vowels at the beginning, whereas the the imper sorry the so that's for the sorry it's actually the other way around. The actives had says here in variable theme vowel, and then the statives are the one with the class A theme vowels. However, as Hebrew developed, this distinction tended to disappear, such that you can have a class A vowel on either an active or a stative. So do not rely on the vowels to tell you which one it is. Instead, you should rely on the actual vocabulary word itself, because the kind of vocabulary word you're dealing with will tell you whether it's an active or stative verb. So kavad, to be great or to be heavy, that is an inherently stative verb. So you don't have to guess in that case. Or asa, or sim, and bo, these are all inherently active verbs. Even though you can see that these two have a kametz, this one has a patach. Those are both class A vowels, but these are active verbs. But it's good to know that when it comes to the vowels for the imperfect, they tend to differ. Most of the time, it'll be a hirek, or that little dot over there, but sometimes it'll be a patach or a kametz. Don't let that confuse you. One of the interesting things about dealing with the Qal is that it has the most variation of the Hebrew verbs, as it says here. When we get to the other forms, such as the nifal, the pl, the pual, the hifil, etc., they're all fairly predictable. They're all fairly straightforward verbs. You should not have much trouble recognizing them when they come up. The general rule with the Qal is that if it's not one of the others, then it's a Qal. As it says here, you As you learn new verb stems, you'll be able to confirm the identity of a troublesome Qal verb by virtue of the fact it's not one of the other verb stems. Think of Qal as the default verb, as it were. If it's not one of the others, it must be a Qal. Here's another table telling you the difference between an active and a stative. So don't worry too much about that. That's not critically important for you to memorize, but it's good to know about it. So memorization, as I mentioned in the beginning, is very important for this. If you were doing things properly, you should have already started memorizing the tables for the perfect, and hopefully you've mastered it at this point. But now you have to add the imperfect verbs on top of it. So try to find a practice sheet like this one. If you don't have the workbook, you should be able to find one on the internet somewhere. The nice thing about Verbum is that you can actually print them out like this. One of the perks of having Verbum Bible software, FYI. Totally not telling you that you have to buy it. I'm just saying that having this software makes life so much easier, especially when you're doing this kind of Bible stuff. Physical textbooks are good too, especially if you're the kind of person who learns best from writing stuff down, especially on the margins of your books. In any case, you can always print this out. Anywho, here is the complete imperfect table. Notice that they're using katal. A lot of textbooks like to use katal as their main verb form. I don't know why. It's a verb that rarely actually occurs in Hebrew. It means to kill. Hebrew has many verbs for killing, and katal is one of the less common ones that will come up. I believe that probably the reason why they prefer using katal is because it's a fairly predictable verb form. So let's go over the thing one more time using katal. So yiktol, he will kill. Tiktol, she will kill. Tiktol, you will kill. Tiktoli, you, a woman, will kill. Ektol, I will kill. Iktolu, they will kill. Tiktolna, they, a group of women, will kill. Tiktolu, you will kill. Tiktolna, you, a group of women, will kill. Niktol, we will kill. Now we learned all the ways of saying that people are planning to kill, which is, very important thing to know. So that's all the grammar for the for the imperfect for this session. So before we get to the translation portion, I just want to give you a heads up. Chapter 15, we will talk about volitionals next. What are volitionals? They indicate desire or command. So there are basically two forms of the volitional verb, the jussive and the imperative, as it says here. So I'm just giving you a heads up. That is what we will discuss next session. For now, let's get to translation work. So I'll spend the next 20 minutes doing translations. We'll do the ones for exercise chapter 13. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. So if you remember last month, depends on when you watched the last session. But last session, we translated Genesis 40, which is when Joseph interpreted the dreams of the two guys. Now, this is the part where Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and it is a long text. There are 57 verses in it. We might not be able to get around to it, but we'll do as much as we can within the remaining time that we have. So here is all the vocab that we need to know for this. I highly recommend that you work on memorizing vocab, whether it's through flashcards or the Memorize app. And remember, when you are memorizing a verb, you're generally memorizing the third person masculine singular Qal perfect form because that's the most basic form of every verb, as you can see here, ana, amad, etc. So let's get to it. So we'll begin with chapter 41, verse 1. Vayhi miketz shnatayim yamim vayachalom paro chalom balayla. Also, I just realized it skips a bunch of verses, so it's not actually all 57. Be that as it may. Let's translate this. And so it was at the end of 2 years, those days, it's like 2 years days. So this is a slightly confusing construction here. Shnatayim yamim, years plus 2 years plus days. So according to this little footnote, this just means 2 full years. So it was at the end of 2 full years, and Pharaoh dreamt a dream at night. So as we usually do, we will look at some of the verbs that occur here. So yachalom and vayhi. So vayhi is the preterite or vaiktol form of haya. So here is the basic form haya. Notice that in this form, the third radical, the last he drops out, so it just becomes vayhi, and then we eliminate that, and then the yod here signifies that it's third person masculine plural, and then vayachalom, again a vaiktol or a preterite form. You can see that there's a yod here. The fact that there's a yod there indicates that this is third person masculine singular. So one of the fun things about Hebrew is you'll notice that the 3-letter root tends to be repeated for both verbs and nouns. So vayachalom, he dreamt, chalom, dream. So that 3-letter root is used for both. And then verse 8, Vayhi baboker vaishlach vaikra et kol chochme mitzrayim vaisaper paro lahem et chalomo velo yad'u et pitron hachalom. So it was in the morning, and he called all of the wise men of Egypt, and Pharaoh told to them his dream, and they did not know the interpretation of the dream. So that's a close word for word translation. Let's look at the verbs again. Vayhi, same as the first vayhi that we ran into. And then vaishlach, another vaiktol form. Once again, these are all third person masculine singular. I'll just might as well underline all of them for you. Now, 3 of them, vayhi, vaishlach, and vaikra, are all qal forms, whereas this last one, vaisaper, this is a PL actually. So we haven't learned what the PL means yet, but we've already run into it. Here's a PL right here. The fact that it's a PL should not confuse you too much. It has the same basic preformatives as the qal. So it has a yod there that tells you it's third person masculine singular. But notice that it has a shva. So actually that's one of the ways you can tell this is a PL, that the vowel is a shva. That does not happen in a qal. We'll talk about that when we actually learn PL forms. So, oh, sorry, I forgot to include this one. Valoid u. So sometimes in a preterite form, the v is separated from the actual verb itself by the word lo, and they did not. But make no mistake, this whole thing is a Vaiktol form or a preterite form. And the fact that this has the Shurik Vav at the end tells you that it is a plural form. They did not know. Verse 9. Vaisaper sar hamaskim el paro lemor bayamim ha rishonim chatanu al hamelech anochi. So we see the reintroduction of our old friend, the master of the chief cupbearer, or the Sar Hamaskim, Mashkim, sorry. And let's translate this. And the chief cupbearer told to Pharaoh, saying, in the former days, so it's literally in the first days, but idiomatically you would want to translate this as in the former days or in past. Chatanu al hamelech. So we sinned against the king. That's an odd construction. You could just say I sinned against the king. Notice the noon and the shurek vav. So if you recall, that is the subformative for the first person first person plural, but it's only a single person who sinned against Pharaoh in this context. So it's a little odd in that case. So let's look at the verbs again. Veisaper. Again, a vaiktol. It is a PL, third person masculine singular. And then lemor. So this is another thing that we haven't discussed yet. This is an infinitive. So infinitives will come up later on as another form of a verb, distinct from both the perfect, imperfect, and the volitional. This is a Qal infinitive from amar, which is to say. So the infinitive, basically, you want to translate it as to. So to say, or saying. So it will, in this case, saying is more appropriate for the context. Khatanu, I already explained that. It's a kal, just FYI. There we go. Me, I missed the last two words of this verse. Anochi visar haofim. So it's plural actually because it's me and the chief baker. They both sinned against Pharaoh. Now let's get to verse 10. Vayichar af paro ba avadav vayiten oti ba mishmar bet sar ba hatabachim oti ve'et sar haofim. And Pharaoh got mad. It's literally, if you want to be literal about it, and Pharaoh's nose got hot. Hebrew is a very colorful language like that. But we will just render it as Pharaoh got mad at his servants, and he gave me into the prison. Actually, he placed me in prison. So Natan normally is translated to give, but here it would make more sense to translate as he placed me in prison. The house of the sort of like Sarhatabachim. Forgot how to render this one again. It's like the chief guard. Mishmar is confinement. You just render it as prison. So once again, the verbs are Vaichar, Vaiten. That's just those two. Both of them have this. They're basically the same form. Third person, masculine singular, preterite, Qal. You can tell from the fact that they have the same preformatives here. Verse 11. Uvalayla echad halamnu halom ani vehu esh ke pitron halomo halamnu. So at night, um, one night, we dreamed a dream, I and he. Hope you remember your pronouns here. Each as the interpretation of his dream we dreamt. Okay, so he's recounting what happened in our previous chapter when there were the dreams that needed to be interpreted. So here we have halamnu, which occurs twice. Actually, let me see. They're not quite the same. You can tell this one has a patach and this one has a comments, but they both have the sufformative nu. Actually, so actually in this case, correction. In this case, turns out this is. I think this one is a noun form actually, whereas this is the verb. See, this is where it can get confusing if you're not careful. The our dream and we dreamt would look the same. All not exactly the same. They would look very similar in Hebrew. The way you will tell the difference is with the voweling, and of course the context helps. We dreamt a dream here. Here it's our dream. So halamnu is a kal, first person plural, perfect, from halam, which means to dream. So here's the basic form, halam. And then we have the sufformative nun shurek vav, which is how we know it's we. So the two guys dreamt, and then what happens next? Verse 12, Vasam itanu ish ivri eved lasar hatabakim vayiptar lanu et chalomotenu ish ke chalomo patar. So, and he set us the and sort of like, and there was there a man, a Hebrew man. So, and placed with us was a Hebrew man rather. So Ivri means Hebrew, and then he is an Eved, a slave or servant of the chief guard, Lesart Hatabachim, and he interpreted for us our dream. Each as his dream he interpreted. Hebrew has this way of like repeating the same thing in two different ways. So first it will say, he interpreted for us our dreams, and then it says, each as his dream he interpreted. So the verbs would be vesam, vaiptar, and then patar. So vesam comes from sim. So this is the preterite third person masculine singular form of it, but it's actually no. This is actually not a preterite. This is just a regular perfect verb. Um, it means placed, to put or to place. So he was placed with us here. And then yiptar, this is from patar, which means to, sorry, that's how you write it in cursive Hebrew, but this is not cursive Hebrew. Patar, um, it means to interpret. You actually get pitron, interpretation from it as well. So vayiptar is a vital form. Um, it's a preterite. He interpreted for us. Um, third person, masculine, singular, Qal. And this one is also third person, masculine, singular, but Qal, but it's a perfect, not a preterite. I'll see we're running low on time, so let me just do one more verse and then we will skip the rest of the translation. Actually, we'll do two more verses, 13 and 14, and we'll conclude. Let's do both of them in one go. Vayhi ka'asher patar lanu chen haya ote samta al kani ve oto talita Vayishlach Paro, Vayikra et Yosef, Vayetze min habor, Vayavo el Paro. So, and so it was, just as he interpreted for us, thus, chen, he was with me, you placed upon my office. So he got his office back. And him, you hung. So this comes from the word hung. And then verse 14. And Pharaoh sent and he called Joseph, and he went out from the pit and he went to Pharaoh. So let's try to highlight the verbs really quickly and then we'll conclude. Here are all of the verbs. And really quickly, you can tell that most of them are preterite, third person, masculine Qals. So any that begins with a v and then a yod, those are all the same. So there's only really three here that aren't. So haya, it's your basic third person masculine singular form. Samta, again, that's from sim. That is the second person masculine singular Qal perfect from you placed, and then talita also second person masculine singular Qal perfect. This comes from tala, which is to hang. Notice that the hey drops out and is replaced by a yod. That tends to happen when you place certain suffirmatives, and this is a weak root. Don't worry about that for now. That'll be discussed later. So there we go. You've got your translation for this session. So we'll just skip the rest of this because there's a lot of it. And then next week we will skip ahead to Genesis 42, and we'll also talk about volitional verbs. So that about wraps it up.
Thank you so much for that, Louis. I really appreciate it. Sorry we're under the gun here, but we'll pick it back up within a few weeks to a month, Lord willing.
Lord willing.
Yeah. Okay. And by the way, what were we covering next time?
Yes. So next one will be the Qal Volitionals. So we just finished Qal Imperfects. So volitionals were basically imperative and jussive verbs.
Yeah. Okay. You want me to share screen there?
Yeah, you can turn it back on really quickly. So this is just a sneak peek of what we're gonna cover. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, good deal. Thank you so much once again, Lewis. I know this is a little demanding on your time and you're a very busy man, so I really appreciate you
Yeah.
coming and doing this as
Hey, it's
always.
my pleasure. It's helpful for me as well because, as I mentioned before, even though I've been doing this for a very long time, you're never too advanced to do a refresher. So you'll notice that I'm remembering things as well as we go along. I learned all this before, but I need
Mm.
to be reminded of it as well.
Yeah, I've kind of noticed just from personal experience that there's things that I know, but until you go to actually teach them, you then realize,
Yeah,
okay, well, now I know it a whole lot better. So,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, once again, thank you for coming on and doing this. And everybody, don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And I once again appreciate y'all watching. Also, check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology, or hit the join button here below. Should be below Lewis to join and become a member of the channel. And you'll get access to extra perks, including extra content and videos. All right. See y'all later. God bless.